1997 was a pretty good year for video games. The very first Fallout game was released late in the year. We saw The Curse of Monkey Island, but the fun wasn't limited to just PC gamers. The Nintendo 64 saw the seminal first-person shooter GoldenEye, and Squaresoft jumped ship from Nintendo to release Final Fantasy VII for the disc-based PlayStation system, a move that arguably brought the franchise into the mainstream and undeniably drove up sales of the console that year. Many PlayStation owners were also anticipating a different Final Fantasy game. Local retailers had included copies of Volume 2 of the digital PlayStation Underground magazine with pre-orders of Final Fantasy VII. And included on this disc were not only demos from Final Fantasy VII and Bushido Blade, but trailers for the upcoming Saga Frontier and another new game, Final Fantasy Tactics. This game looked different than any previous Final Fantasy. Instead of a turn-based RPG, it seemed closer to something like the old Sega game Shining Force, with squad-based tactical combat. Yet all the familiar Final Fantasy aspects were present. You had chocobos, summons, magic, knights, wizards, so the game certainly looked intriguing. Now, the game is remembered very fondly today by a lot of people. It's regarded as one of the finest games on the first PlayStation console. But at the time, the game was controversial to say the least. The unfamiliar combat and job systems, the dark and convoluted storyline, and a admittedly subpar localization made the game inaccessible to many players. Now, despite that, Final Fantasy Tactics is an incredible game. The combat and job systems are robust and fun. The story, while dark, is deep and rich. The characters are vibrant and alive. And if that translation was faulty, the basic gist of the story could still be understood. Beyond that, the soundtrack is top-notch. From driving battle themes to softer tunes of introspection or twisted songs of intrigue. Now, that faulty translation was remedied later on when the game was re-released for the PlayStation Portable console in the War of the Lions edition. Now, this edition of the game was also updated to include many fully voiced animated cutscenes, new content, but most importantly, an entirely new translation, replacing much of the awkward and sometimes nonsensical dialogue of the original with a far better localization worthy of the story. Now, this release had its own problems, most notably slowdowns during certain battle animations. And the very gritty and dark nature of the story has still kept many from being able to enjoy this title. And I'm not kidding when I say that this game is dark. Everyone fell in love with Sephiroth in Final Fantasy VII, and Kefka from Final Fantasy VI is still touted by many as one of their favorite video game villains of all time. And I love them both, don't get me wrong. But they're both cartoons. They're not scary. You love to hate them, but neither has a story that's particularly compelling. They're both kind of flat, one-note bad guys who really only exist to drive the heroes towards the final conflict. And there's not much else to them. Final Fantasy Tactics, on the other hand, well, it lacks a singular primary villain, at least until very near the end of the game. But it does have both villains and heroes who are tragic, flawed, and far more realistic in their desires and their loves and their hates. There are few outright heroes in this story, and many who are villains only become so because they saw no other way to survive. This is a dark and often depressing game, and even the ending, while victorious, is bittersweet, tragic for some of the protagonists, and still controversial and debated to this day. This may be a turnoff to some people, but I think it's what makes Final Fantasy Tactics special. It's complex, deep, and challenging, and I'm not even talking about the gameplay. The gameplay itself is rich and rewarding and fun, and overall that game sticks with you even years later. And I still think back on a game that I bought on a whim because of a trailer, only to fall absolutely in love with it. And since this is the War of the Lions version, you'll get to enjoy not only the fully animated cutscenes, but a top-notch translation that really brings out the subtleties and the depth of the story. I can't express how much I'm really looking forward to sharing this with all of you. Before we get started, however, I would like to share the original opening to the game. The War of the Lion version has an all-new intro, which is slightly different. And we'll talk about those differences when we get to episode 1 of this series. For now, though, let's take a look at the original opening to Final Fantasy Tactics. We begin the game by being introduced to a scholar of ancient history who invites us to join him on a quest for the truth, reminding us that history is always written by the victors and doesn't always tell us the whole truth, depending on who wrote it. So after entering our character information and our birthday, he begins to tell us of the Zodiac Brave story, and our story begins with this pan over the countrysides and fields of the kingdom of Ivalice. As the sun comes over the mountains, the title of the game is revealed to us: Final Fantasy Tactics. Our story begins in this ruined courtyard, the remains of what must have once been a town or castle, as a solitary knight, astride his chocobo, motions for his companions to move out. Who is this solitary knight? Well, we'll be meeting him soon enough. We'll learn all about him. But for now, just enjoy these shots of him leading his forces on their mission. And so this knight has led his troops to the entrance to this chapel. What are they doing there? What's their mission? Well, we'll find that out soon enough. So there you have the original opening to Final Fantasy Tactics. We'll be discussing some of the ways that differs from the new opening when we see it in episode 1 of this series. So please join me for episode 1 of our Let's Play of Final Fantasy Tactics War of the Lions. I'll see you then.